I actually wanted to, if you don't mind, to read you some short excerpts from two articles that I would love for you to respond to. So one is actually from a woman who is an editor of Haaretz opinion section, Anat Kam. She's the deputy editor of the opinion section at Haaretz. And she wrote a piece in response to my op-ed that I wrote at the Daily Beast. And her article is called "Israel's Got Major Problems, but It's Not an Apartheid State." And she writes, Israel is not an apartheid state. According to Merriam-Webster, apartheid is a racial segregation and specifically a former policy of segregation and political, social, and economic discrimination against the non-white majority in the Republic of South Africa. This definition is easy to dissolve. Israel does not have a racial segregation implemented by law. It's an easy fact check. And then she continues, there are Arab citizens with full equal rights in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, as well as in the Israeli court system, including the Supreme Court. There are Arab doctors, professors, policemen, teachers, and countless other professionals working side by side with Jews. Not all of them consider themselves Palestinian, and it's not for Halper or anyone else to define their national identity for them. And there are many Druze and Bedouins who are part of the Arab population in Israel who serve in the Israel Defense Forces. So, and then she makes one more argument. Calling Israel an apartheid state also flattens a complicated but crucial issue. It does not distinguish between the state of Israel within the Green Line, Israel's eastern border prior to the 1967 Six-Day War, and the occupied West Bank. Make no mistake, Israel's occupation of the West Bank and its blockade of the Gaza Strip is a decades-long and ongoing war crime with ethnic segregation and no equal protection under the law, but it is not within the state of Israel. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, Katie, I should read my book out loud to your audience. So let me do this. I heard four things we need to unpack. So we can go through them. One of them is about Israel's jurisdiction and what it covers, and this idea of a partition between the Green Line and the occupied territories. So that's one. The other one is about, also another mythology that we need to unpack about, Palestinian inclusion in Israeli society. So the Palestinian citizens of Israel and where they're included. That's the second myth. The third thing that we need to unpack has to do more with law and what the Convention on Apartheid tells us from 1973 and the system that it did condemn. And the last thing that we're going to need to unpack is going to be about what is a racial theory of Zionism and how does that apply? So I'm going to work backwards. And if I forget, I hope that you remember so you can remind me about these 4 points. So let's just start with the first one really, really quick. The idea that this editor wants to distinguish between the Green Line and the territories, one, is a very, very old and dead argument and doesn't actually take into account facts on the ground today, right? One may have said that partition was relevant and existed and had some meaning in the early 90s even, which even then was stretching it. But the truth is that this is a false partition. There is no distinction between Israel's governance over all people from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. It just applies different systems, different legal systems to the people that live between those borders. And Israel itself hasn't even declared the borders. So the idea that there's a green line to speak of is also mythology. What green line? What green line? It's supposed to refer to the armistice lines of 1949 that are also conflated with the 1967 borders, so to speak, after the 1967 war. Israel never recognized those borders, has since, the ascendance of the Likud government. Actually, no, right after the 1967 war, it was a an Israeli labor government that began the settlement enterprise under Eshkol. And forget the names right now, but it was a labor government that began it. It was accelerated under Menachem Begin after the ascendance of Likud in 1977, which is to say that Israel has settled all sides of no line. So that's one. Israel has a single jurisdiction between the river and the sea, and that is only distinguished by different ways that it governs and discriminates against the Palestinians. It has one goal of taking more territory for Zionist settlement and shrinking the number of Palestinians and concentrating those that remain on the smallest amounts of land. It's a settler colonial project. It uses martial law in the West Bank, all-out warfare in Gaza, administrative and civil law in East Jerusalem, and civil law within Israel to achieve that discrimination. Moving on. Number 2. All right, check. Number 2. What about the Palestinians who can be in parliament and can be in court systems and whatnot? So whoever says this, one, is also likely to tell us, oh, well, in the United States, right, the United States can exercise Jim Crow and be separate but equal, right? Which was an argument that Americans made, which was an argument that American apologists continue to make about, discrimination in the United States, that they could call the United States a democracy, even though Black people, right, had to be in separate classrooms, had to achieve separate education, couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. So I just want folks that, by way of analogy, right, start there. If you can't imagine what it means for Palestinians to participate in some realms of life, but still to be racially subjugated, start there. Now, in regards to the specificity of Palestine, understand that when Israel was established in 1948, it applied martial law in Israel, right, where it declared its independence, only to the Palestinians who did not become refugees. So for 18 years, it exercised martial law on the Palestinian population within its borders in order to achieve territorial expansion within Israel, because it builds 370 settlements immediately within Israel, but they're Jewish Zionist settlements. And it enables officers to arrest Palestinians, to check for their papers, to deport them immediately, to shut down media, to shut down newspapers, to prohibit any kind of gatherings. It's literally the martial law that we see applied under the military occupation we know today in the West Bank, that was applied against the citizens who remain, who are approximately 100 to 120,000 in 1948. That application, according to Ben-Gurion, the military law had no security purpose. It actually had a settler colonial purpose, which was to achieve the taking of the greatest amount of territory with the least number of Palestinians. And that's why it remained in place. And what that martial law did, right, was to create an exception, a racial exception for those Palestinians who remained, who ostensibly were not removed from their homes, ostensibly are within Israel, and yet are still subject to an entirely different system. And that racial exception remains until this day. And that's why we see police forces within Israel attack, for example, use lethal force against Palestinians, as they did in 2013, in October, 2003, when 13 Palestinians were killed during their protests in the midst of the Second Intifada, what's known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It's why we can see in May 2021, mobs of Jewish Israelis chasing down Palestinian citizens in their own homes. And the Palestinian citizens have no one to call to protect them. Tamir Nafar, I remember this vividly, was on television saying, I can't even call the Israeli police to protect me from these mobs because they will protect the settlers as they attack me, right? This is the inseparability of the state and state violence and the settler, right? On whose behalf that state violence exists in order to entrench their takings. And that's to say nothing of the myriad ways that the law and the system itself discriminates against these Palestinian citizens. That Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights, for example, has a database of over 60 laws that demonstrates, right, how Israel either explicitly violates the rights of those Palestinian citizens, or like as a prima facie case, or it does it by disparate impact. So for example, here's one example. Employers, landlords can easily say only those who have served in the military can apply for this job or for this housing. Well, what does that mean for the Palestinians who do not serve in the army, right? It means that they're not welcome. That's not an explicit, it's not prima facie, but it's obviously discriminatory. So suffice it to say that this is a mythology. And for this person who cares about listening to the people who are affected, let the Palestinian citizens of Israel speak for themselves and tell you what their lives are like. They are suffering. They continue to suffer and to endure forced displacement, as the Palestinians from Akrit and Bir'am in the north are citizens of the state, but still internally displaced persons because they can't return to their homes of origin, right? Or the Palestinians who are in the Naqab in the south, where they are being forcibly displaced and removed into urban townships. So that was number 2. Number 3, we're on apartheid. Apartheid, okay, does not refer to what happened in South Africa. In 1973, just like racism does not refer to any single place on earth, right? But according to the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the first human rights treaty drafted in 1965, but not ratified until far later because states didn't want to recognize it, and primarily the United States. The United States didn't ratify the CERD Convention, I think, until it was 1994. All right. But apartheid becomes a crime against humanity when a treaty declares it as such in 1973. And though it's in reference, right, it's telling us about a system of governance in Southern Africa, Namibia, and South Africa, it's actually, right, telling us about a system of governance that can exist anywhere. And you have there enumerated the 6 elements, right, non-exhaustive elements, which means some of these, maybe all of them, perhaps more, that together would constitute a form of apartheid. And what it has to feature is that the law is used, right? That the law is used to ensure the domination of one racial group over any other racial group, right? And achieved through their separation. Explicitly, apartheid does not refer to a specific case study. Apartheid is a system, and it can appear everywhere. But just to be clear there, neither the CERD, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, nor the treaty, right, that recognizes apartheid as a crime against humanity, neither one of those refers to white supremacy or Black bodies or African descendants, right? They're referring to racial groups. So here we get into this idea of, so what about her 4th point? Her 4th point. You know, whatever it is, it can't be racism because Israel doesn't, Israel is not necessarily a white supremacist movement that features, the subjugation of a minority over a Black majority. She's literally using the South African case study here to make that argument. Now, in fairness to her, even B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization that was amongst the first to conclude after Yesh Din that Israel is an apartheid system, comes to the same conclusion. I mean, different in that they say there is apartheid, but there's no racism. I mean, that's literally what they say. They say there's Jewish supremacy, but there's no racism. And in that, again, they repeat this mantra that because there's no Black, this isn't about against Black people. There's Black Israelis, there's Black Palestinians, they're Afro-descendant, da-da-da-da-da. This understanding of racism is horribly flawed, okay? And this gets us into the story of, well, what is race? Well, what we know for sure, that contrary to those, to the biological, the biological arguments about race, that it's somehow connected to how we're born, that has been long, discredited. Our DNA is too similar across humanity to be able to, to evidence some sort of a eugenics argument about what distinguishes us from one another. So we've long known that that's not racism, right? We also know, according to what a lot of critical racial theorists and race scholars will show and tell us, racism is a construct, right? Racial categories have been constructed. Cedric Robinson, right, author of Black Marxism, who racial capitalism is largely attributed to as a concept, shows us that across time and space, that racism changes. It's historically and materially contingent. It produces a political economy for those in power in order to justify the accumulation of wealth among some for the deprivation of wealth. And here by deprivation, I'm saying not just money wealth, right? But health wealth, opportunity wealth, life wealth, right? From others. It's what Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes to us as what subjects certain groups to the condition of premature death. This has nothing, right, to do with some biological function that we need to untrace. This is about studying the historical and material conditions that are racializing certain groups, that are subjecting them to a condition of premature death and deprivation. And this is precisely what Zionism, right, has subjected Palestinians to. Ipso facto, Zionism conditions the deprivation of Palestinians of their land, of their life, of their futures, right? And subjects them to lesser life chances, in fact, is predicated on their elimination in order to succeed. And so now we should also think about, our Palestinian intellectual tradition, who have long, provided for us racial theories about Zionism. And primary for me amongst them is Fayez Sayegh, who is the architect, and the primary engine for Resolution 3379. It's the 1975 resolution that declares that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, who shows us as early as 1965 in his pamphlet on the Zionist colonization of Palestine that Zionism is constituted, Zionism's insistence that Jews are a racial group, irrespective of religious piety or ethnic heterogeneity, produces three corollaries of self-segregation, right? Of racial segregation, racial purity, right? And racial supremacy. And also provides for us a theory of understanding that if other colonial movements in Asia and Africa were predicated on the domination of racial groups, racial domination, Zionism is predicated on racial elimination. So how you can understand how, it's what Nadia Abul-Hajj has critiqued, Zionists for, which is the entire Zionist movement is predicated on the ideas that Jews are a race and therefore can establish the state. But as soon as Israel is formed, now that racial distinction disappears and they try to say Jews are not a race, Palestinians are not a race, except we've been racialized. We've been racialized. And this is not to say anything, Katie, of the way that, how, we're treated by the military occupation system or the criminal system, how there's a shoot to kill policy that basically assumes Palestinians are guilty, right? Until they're proven innocent, how there's racial anxiety around Palestinians, not because of the threat they pose, but because existentially, the more Palestinians are alive, right? Or that live, the lesser chance that Israel, as, a place that's established of Jewish supremacy and a demographic Jewish majority, can be viable. We are an existential threat by existence. So these are the ways that race are constructed. So yeah, her article, whatever. All that to say is I disagree thoroughly with everything that she says. And it's really just so exhausting, right? That she can make such bankrupt, old arguments that we have dismantled as Palestinian scholars and others over and over again. And yet precisely because of the epistemic erasures of Palestinians in knowledge production and of advocates speaking for ourselves, we don't get read. And then we have to wait for Israeli human rights groups and legacy human rights groups to say the same thing that we've been saying, for decades now. And she's doing the same thing when she's trying to recycle these old bankrupt arguments.